We're going to begin factoring today. This is Learning Plan 3-6.1, and we're going to factor out the greatest common factor and then factor by grouping. Writing a polynomial as the product of two or more simpler polynomials is called factoring. If you notice, the 3x times the 5x is 15x squared. 3x times negative 2 is negative 6x. So if we see this, we can factor out a 3x and we're left with that. Factoring undoes or reverses multiplying. Now when we were in grade school, we learned that dividing was the opposite of multiplying. Here's a way to distinguish factoring and dividing. Suppose you had 20 floor tiles. You could take your floor tiles and say, what kind of a rectangular room could I get with these 20 floor tiles? And you would find that you would have one that's 4 by 5, and that would be your room. That's factoring. Dividing, say you had those same 20 floor tiles and you said, I want to have a room that's 6 tiles long. How wide can that room be? Well, 1 tile long makes 6. 2 tiles long makes 12. 3 tiles long makes 18. And we still have 2 tiles left over. So we could put a third of a tile at the end here, and we would find that we would have 6 by 3 1/3. So dividing, you start out with both factoring and dividing, you start out with the same thing, 20. In the one case, for dividing, you know one of the two numbers that you're going to be figuring out. For factoring, you just want to get something that is a rectangle. Factoring out the greatest common factor. The first step in factoring is always going to be to factor out the greatest common factor. Why? Because once we get out, it's easier to see what we've got left over. Here, what's the greatest common factor? What do those two terms, 7k and 28, have in common? Well, if we divide them both, which is what I'm going to do, what's the biggest number I can divide both of them by? 7, and I'm left with k plus 4. So my factored form is 7 times k plus 4. Notice I did 2 divisions at the same time, separated by this plus sign. So let's try this one, 32m plus 24. The biggest number I can take out of both of these is 8, and I'm left with 4m plus 8. It goes into 24 3 times. So my factored form is 8 times 4m plus 3. I'm going to change colors here. 8a minus 9. The only number I can divide them both by is 1. Now, I don't know if our book wants to call that a factored form or not, but 1 times 8a minus 9. No matter how many tiles you have, you can always make a room that's 1 tile wide and that many tiles long. I'm going to change colors again. 5z plus 5, and I can divide both of these by 5, and I'm left with z plus 1. So my factored form is 5 times z plus 1. Okay, you do these two. 54m minus 45 is divisible by 9, and you're left with 6m minus 5. 2k minus 7 is only divisible by 1, and you're left with 2k minus 7. How about this one? Now, if you notice this time, not only can we divide by the number 3, we can also divide by the letter x, or variable x. And here we're left with x squared plus 5. So our factored form is 3x times x squared plus 5. try this one. The difference this time is that instead of just being 2 terms long, it's going to be, it's going to be 3 terms long. The biggest number we can divide everything by is 25. And then if we go by the letters, the smallest letter is the biggest number we can divide by. So we're left with 4m squared, 2m plus 1. So our factored form is 25m cubed times 4m squared minus 2m plus 1. Try this one. The difference this time is there are 2 variables that we will be able to divide by. We can divide by the number 5, the letter m, and the lowest power of m is to the 4th, and the lowest power of x is to the 3rd. Here, we're left with 1. Now, some people would be tempted to not put anything there, but you have to have that placeholder there. So 1 plus 3m x cubed minus 4x cubed. You do this one. Okay, the biggest number is 5, the smallest power of m is squared, and the smallest power of n is n. We're left with 4m n squared, 3m n, 2, and then there's no letters left for the last part. So that is our factored form, this times that. Okay, now sometimes we can see that there are, both of these terms have an a plus 2. So when we go to do our factoring, a plus 2 times a minus 3 plus a plus 2 times a plus 6, we're still dividing right here. I mean, separating our 2 terms right there. The first term has an a plus 2 in it, and so does the second term. We're left with a minus 3, and we're left with a plus 6. Now, a and a makes 2a. Negative 3 plus 6 is positive 3. So my factored form is a plus 2 from here, and then we just simplified that second part. Let's try this one. Y minus 1 times y plus 3 minus y minus 1 times y plus 4. Okay, we can factor out a y minus 1 from both of them, and we're left with y plus 3 minus y plus 4. Y minus y is nothing. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. So our factored form is y minus 1 times negative 1. Next one. Okay, 3x minus 2 times x plus 1 plus 3x minus 2 times 2x minus 5. Okay, we can factor 3x minus 2, and we're left with x plus 1 plus 2x minus 5. X and 2x makes 3x. 1 minus 5 is minus 4. So our factored form is 3x minus 2, 3x minus 4. Next one, I'm going to change colors here. Z times a minus b cubed minus 2w times a minus b squared. Okay, we can factor out an a minus b squared, and we're left with z times a minus b minus 2w. And so that is our factored form. Next one. Oh, I think they want us to multiply this out, za minus zb minus 2w. Next one. Okay, we can factor out an m plus p squared, and we're left with 5 times m plus p minus 3. Oops, I'm sorry, we can factor out a 5. So we're left with m plus 3 minus 3 and minus 3 times m plus p squared. So, looks like that's not one of our choices, so we have to multiply this out. This part is fine. M plus p squared is m squared plus 2mp plus p squared times negative 3 is negative 3m squared minus 6mp minus 3p squared. So we have m plus p minus 3 in there also. Looks like it's this one up here, huh? Okay. Factor out the greatest common factor here. Notice k squared a plus 5b plus m squared times a plus 5b squared. Okay, so we have an a plus 5b out front. We're left with k squared plus m squared times a plus 5b. Now they probably want us to multiply that out. Nah, let's just leave it like that. Now, k squared plus m squared a plus 5m squared b. I don't know if that's the way they want us to leave it or not. Either one of those is correct. I don't like the parentheses, the double sets of parentheses. Now, what do they mean by factoring in two ways? Well, if you notice, we could rewrite this as negative r, take out a negative r out of 6r squared, negative 6r squared plus 5r, and we're left with positive 6r minus 5. Or we could factor out a positive r, and we're left with out of negative 6r squared plus 5r, and we're left with negative 6r plus 5. Both of these factored forms are correct. You have to know which, you just have to determine which way the negative sign is going to go. Okay, so factor this one in two ways. We can factor out a y for negative 4y to the 5th minus 3y cubed plus 8y, and we're left with negative 4y to the 4th minus 3y squared plus 8. Or we can factor out a negative y, and we're left with positive 4y to the 4th plus 3y squared minus 8. So either way will work. Okay, how do we factor by grouping? Factoring by grouping works best if something is 4 terms long. All right, so we're going to 6p minus 6q plus rp minus rq. We're going to treat this as 2 separate divisions. We can factor a 6 out of this, and we're left with p minus q. We can factor an r out of this, and we're left with p minus q. So what we've got here is 2 terms with a, I'm going to change colors here now so that you can see that we're doing something different. We're going to factor a p minus q out of both of them, and we're left with 6 plus r. So our factored form is p minus q, 6 plus r. This one, I'm going to group them this way. In the first case, I factor a 3 out, and I'm left with m minus n. Factor an x out, and I'm left with m minus n. Notice these two are the same in both of them, so I'm going to, rewrite that as m minus n out front, and I'm left with 3 plus x. So my factored form is m minus n, 3 plus x. Okay, how about this one? X cubed plus 8x squared minus 5x minus 40. Okay, so out of these first two, I'm going to factor an x squared. I'm left with x plus 8. Now I'm going to factor this negative sign out. So when I do, that changes this to a positive sign. So minus 5 parentheses x plus 8. Notice now I'm left with my x plus 8 in both cases. So x plus 8 out front, and I'm left with x squared minus 5. Okay, let's try that again. I'll show you again. xy minus 2y minus 4x plus 8. Now remember how we factored out the negative sign, so we're going to change this to a negative. So we factor a y out of the first two, and we're left with x minus 2. And we factor 4 out of the second two, negative 4, and we're left with x minus 2. So now when we do our division, we can divide by x minus 2, and we're left with y minus 4. So our factored form is x minus 2, y minus 4. Let's try it again. AB minus 7A, divide that one, minus 5B plus 35. By now you should be seeing that when this is a negative sign, change that sign at the end. Factor an A out, we're left with B minus 7. Factor a negative 5 out, we're left with B minus 7. So factor this, we can factor a b minus 7 out front, and we're left with a minus 5. So our factored form is b minus 7, a minus 5. So when you factor by grouping, you get the terms collected, factor within those groups, and then factor the entire polynomial. So let's look at this one. Kn plus mn minus k minus m. Okay, factor an n out of the first two, we're left with k plus m. When we see this sign is negative, change that to a positive. Since we can't factor anything out, this is where that dividing by 1 business comes in. plus m. Now, we do have something in common in both of them, a k plus m. We're left with n minus 1. So our factored form is k plus m, n minus 1. Same thing here. Okay, we're going to factor these separately. 3x, we're left with a minus 2y. Negative sign tells us to change that, so we're going to put a 1 there, a minus 2y. You know you're right when these both terms have the same parts. I'm going to change colors again. A minus 2y. Out front, we're left with 3x minus 1. Now, let's look at this one. If you notice, 10x squared y squared minus 18 plus 15y squared minus 12x squared. If we factored these two, we can get a 2 out of the first two, and we can get a 3 out of the second two. We're left with 5x squared y squared minus 9 and 5y squared minus 4x squared. Notice these two do not have their common terms. What we should do is see if we can get the y squared next to the other y squared. So let's rearrange this. I'm going to change colors. Let's rearrange this as 10 x squared y squared, then put the plus 15 y squared next, then minus 12x squared minus 18. Now notice I did that so that I get the powers of the variable lower. I could have written the negative 18 first, but it's easier to switch it around the other direction. This sign makes this a positive. We can factor a 5y squared out of these two, and we're left with 2x squared plus 3. Factor a 6 out of these two, and we're left, negative 6, excuse me, and we're left with 2x squared plus 3. Now we've got our common term, 2x squared plus 3, and we're left with 5y squared minus 6. So when you see these two common terms, make sure you get them next to each other. Okay? So you see you've got the p squareds to get next to each other. 2k p squared minus 3p squared minus 4k plus 6. Make sure you get the constant term at the end. All right, we can factor a p squared out of the first two. We're left with 2k minus 3. Negative sign, we can factor a 2 out of the second two, negative 2, excuse me. We're left with 2k minus 3. So our factored form is 2k minus 3 p squared minus 2.